What if I told you that on the third day of the second week in Bahrain there was a lap that left the entire paddock silent? And that Max Verstappen, unintentionally, ended up revealing exactly why Ferrari is so scary with the SF-26. Because it wasn't just a fast lap from Charles Leclerc. It wasn't just a good time. It was the first real sign that Ferrari has solved the biggest problem with the 2026 regulation, while others are still trying to understand it. And when you analyze what Verstappen said about these new cars, about energy management, clipping, the impossibility of going flat, everything starts to fit together in a disturbing way. What happened on that third day in Bahrain was not a drill. It was a warning. Are we facing Ferrari's first real coup in the 2026 era? Or are we misinterpreting what really happened on that lap? The second week of testing in Bahrain was no longer a simple mileage test. It was the moment when teams began to remove weight, fine-tune engine maps, and simulate real qualifying scenarios. The first week had been a poker game. The second was when some began to show cards, although not all of them. And the third day was the turning point. Until that moment, the general discourse revolved around the difficulty of the 2026 regulation. The new hybrid systems require almost surgical energy management. The battery has more prominence, the deployment is more aggressive but also more limited, and the phenomenon of clipping, that loss of electrical power before the end of the straight, has become the great silent enemy. Max Verstappen explained it clearly: these cars do not allow you to go flat without thinking. The pilot has to constantly manage energy. It's not just attacking curves, it's deciding when to use battery and when to save it. That completely changes the nature of piloting. And that's where Ferrari comes in. On that third day, when Charles Leclerc sets the fastest lap of the week, what caught the eye was not the number itself. It was the way the SF-26 behaved in the most sensitive sectors of the circuit. On the main Sakhir straight, one of the longest on the calendar, many cars were beginning to show clear symptoms of clipping. It was noticeable in the telemetry. The speed stopped growing linearly in the last meters. The heat engine was still pushing, but the electric assistance was no longer there. The SF-26 did not show that abrupt drop. Leclerc came out of the final corner with clean traction, with no visible corrections. It activated the electrical deployment early, but what was most impressive was that the delivery was sustained beyond the point where others were beginning to lose momentum. The top speed did not drop dramatically in the final stretch. That means one thing: energy efficiency was under control. But there is an even more important detail. Ferrari did not appear to be running with a minimal wing configuration. The car was not extremely unloaded to disguise speed figures. In the middle curves of the second sector, the SF-26 showed stability, aerodynamic support, and a firm front axle. This indicates that they did not sacrifice load to gain straight. So how is it explained? There are only two possibilities. Either Ferrari has found an extremely efficient way to reduce drag without losing support, or they have optimized the hybrid system so that the electrical deployment is better synchronized with the aerodynamic drag of the car. And this is where everything connects with Verstappen's words. If the big problem with the regulations is that they require constant energy management, the team that manages to make this management almost invisible to the driver will have an enormous advantage. Because it's not just about top speed. It's about mental rhythm. To be able to attack a lap without feeling like the car is limiting you. On that third day lap, Leclerc didn't seem to be surviving the hybrid system. It seemed to dominate him. That's what worried rivals. The second week in Bahrain began as a continuation of testing. It ended with a question floating in the paddock. Has Ferrari found the key to the balance between battery, thermal engine, and aerodynamics before the rest? And if the answer is yes, the SF-26 is not only fast, it is structurally superior in the most critical area of the new regulation. Because it's one thing to set a fast lap in testing, and it is quite another for that return to change the internal conversation of the teams. On the third day of the second week in Bahrain, after that lap by Leclerc, several engineers began to review comparative data beyond the simple final time. They weren't looking at 134 or whatever number it was. They were observing the speed curves, the power delivery, the behavior in transition between acceleration and stabilized phase. And that's where Ferrari started to bother. In this 2026 regulation, the biggest fear is not the lack of total power. It is the irregularity. It is that the car has sharp peaks and drops in energy delivery. The driver has to adapt his style to the battery instead of the limit of the tire. But the SF-26 showed no such oscillations. In the second sector, where aerodynamic efficiency and chassis balance are put to the test, the car did not seem nervous. There were no abrupt corrections to the steering wheel. There was no chronic oversteer at exit. That means downforce was not compromised by a desperate search for top speed. And here appears a key point that many overlooked. If Ferrari can sustain the electric deployment longer without suffering clipping, that implies that energy recovery is also being extremely efficient. Because in these cars, what you deploy on the straight depends directly on what you recover when braking and in partial acceleration phases. This means that the entire thermal engine, MGU, battery and electronic management system is functioning as a coherent ecosystem. And that cannot be improvised in a week. Meanwhile, other teams in the second week were dealing with glaring problems. Some showed speed drops before the DRS sweet spot. Others seemed to have to choose between attacking the first sector or reaching the end of the main straight alive. Ferrari did not give that feeling of commitment. And this is where the psychological effect starts to play. When Verstappen talks about these cars requiring constant management, he is describing a scenario where the driver cannot simply trust the machine. But if a car eliminates that worry, the driver gains mental freedom. You can attack curve by curve without calculating every meter of energy deployment. On that lap on the third day, Leclerc was not managing. I was running. And that changes the narrative. Because if Ferrari has managed to make the SF-26 minimize the feeling of energy restriction, then they don't just have speed. They have potential consistency in qualifying and in the short stint. And that, in a regulation so conditioned by energy, is pure gold. In addition, there is another technical detail that began to generate conversation: the stability of the car when the battery approaches the discharge limit. Normally, when the hybrid system enters a critical phase, the balance of the car can be slightly altered by changes in power delivery. You didn't see that in the Ferrari. The transition was clean. This indicates that the software-mechanical integration is at a very advanced level. It's not just hardware, it's calibration. And this is where the word hidden makes sense. Ferrari had not shown aggressive qualifying simulations in the first week. He hadn't chased headlines. But in the second week, third day, when they release a real lap, what is revealed is not just a good time. It is a solid architecture. The teams did not react publicly. But internally, when a rival does not suffer clipping where you do, that sets off alarms. Because clipping is not corrected with a small aerodynamic update. It is corrected with concept. And if Ferrari already has that concept aligned with the 2026 regulation, then the SF-26 is not a competitive evolution. It is a declaration of intent. This is where fear starts to appear. Because in the preseason, everyone hides things. Everyone pretends. Everyone plays with fuel and maps. But there is something that cannot be faked: the coherence of a concept. And the SF-26 on that lap of Leclerc showed coherence. It was not a miraculous turn sustained by an extreme motor mode. It was not an unloaded car sacrificing curve for straight. It was not an isolated run in perfect conditions. It was a balanced car that solved the biggest dilemma of the 2026 regulation: how to use energy without the energy using you. There is the difference. Because if rivals are still designing around the clipping problem, Ferrari seems to have designed by eliminating it as a main limitation. And that changes everything. In a regulation where the battery has more relative weight than ever, where electrical deployment is decisive on long straights like Bahrain, having stability in energy delivery is not only an advantage in classification. It is a strategic advantage in the race. It means less need for extreme lift and coast. It means less exposure to sudden speed losses. It means less reliance on perfect recovery windows. And that frees the pilot. Let's go back to Verstappen. When he describes these cars as machines that require constant management, he is pointing out a structural weakness of the new regulations. But if Ferrari has reduced that weakness to the background, then the SF-26 is not only competitive, it is philosophically aligned with what 2026 demands. And that's where the paddock gets restless. Because it's one thing to be fast in a specific area. It is quite another to have understood before anyone else the balance between energy recovery, sustained deployment, aerodynamic resistance, and mechanical stability. On that lap on the third day, Leclerc did not show a forced car. Showed a comfortable car in its own concept. And when a car is born comfortable under a new regulation, it is usually a dangerous sign. In addition, there is an invisible but key element: trust. In testing, pilots tend to be cautious. But the way Leclerc attacked the fast sectors indicated that the car was responding exactly as expected. There was no hesitation. There were no constant micro-corrections. This only happens when the energy and aerodynamic balance is well integrated. And if Ferrari has achieved that in the second week of testing, so the question is no longer whether they were fast. The question is how much real margin they were showing. Because in preseason no one teaches everything. And if what we saw was just a first layer, the true potential could be even greater. What happened on that third day in Bahrain was not an isolated headline. It was a silent warning. Verstappen spoke about the regulation problem. Ferrari responded with a lap that seems to have resolved it. Now the mystery is simple and powerful. Was Bahrain the birthplace of the hidden favorite of the 2026 era? Or will we see in the first races that the others also have something in store? While many teams continue trying to adapt to the energy puzzle of the 2026 regulations, managing clipping, adjusting deployment maps, seeking the balance between battery and thermal engine, Ferrari seemed to present a car that does not fight against those limitations, but rather coexists with them naturally. Max Verstappen described the problem. Ferrari indirectly showed a possible solution. And that's what really shocked the paddock. Because in a regulation where energy defines performance, having a system that does not penalize the pilot in the final part of the straight, that does not force him to lift early, that does not alter the balance when the battery enters the critical zone, is a structural advantage. It is not a one-time improvement. It's a concept. Leclerc's return was clean, stable, and sustained. He showed no symptoms of fragility. He showed no obvious sacrifices. And that, in a completely new car under demanding regulations, is what is most disturbing. The real question is not whether the SF-26 was fast in Bahrain. The real question is whether that energy balance we saw is replicable under real qualifying pressure, and under the wear and tear of a full race. If it is, Ferrari has not only started strong. Let me know in the comments what you think about all this.